Hey folks, your test is behind you. Now we move on to the second half of the course, and we're going to start with a focus on muscles. Specifically in this video, I want you to consider the properties of muscle. Let me get out of the way so you can see the sign. Properties of muscle. Is muscle a tissue or is muscle an organ? And looking at differences between different types of muscle tissue, and then ultimately, what does muscle do besides producing movement? In the next video, we'll get into a conversation more about how muscle actually works. So let's start with this idea. Muscle is a tissue that has certain properties, and because of these properties, muscle can do what it does. For example, muscle is electrically excitable. This is important because you have to stimulate muscle to make it contract. So electrically excitable simply means that muscle has the capacity to be stimulated, and when it does, it's going to contract, which is property 2. Muscle is contractible. That is, it can shorten. It can get physically shorter, which causes it to squeeze or to pull. And that's extremely important given what muscle does. Muscle, though, is also extensible, which means it can stretch even beyond its resting length. And that's important, that muscle has some adaptability. Muscle can stretch and respond to stress, and yet ultimately muscle is elastic, which means it has the ability to come back to its regular size. So these are very important properties that you don't see in all tissues. Electrically excitable, contractible, can shorten, can actually stretch, and yet recoil back to its natural size. And by the way, whenever you see terms in this unit, whenever you hear myo or myes or sarco, like sarcolemma or epimysium, that always refers to something to do with muscle or muscle tissue. So let's just look briefly at the 3 kinds, and I'm just going to disappear for a second. The 3 kinds of muscle tissue. We're going to focus primarily on one type, and then we'll do the other ones a little bit later in the course. But let's consider the muscle types here. The first type you see here is the type that we associate with visceral organs or blood vessels. This is smooth muscle. Smooth muscle has what are called spindle-shaped, non-striated, uninucleated fibers. Let's take that one by one. Spindle shape. If you really have a hard time seeing it in the diagram, but the cells are kind of shaped like this. And then the next one laying next to it is kind of like this, or kind of like little spindles, or kind of like discs. And if I can try to draw one here, it's going to be kind of this shape. So spindle shape, non-striated, which you will see on these other 2 types that you don't see here, are these little microscopic lines. They're not visible here, so you don't have that in smooth muscle. And uninucleated, which means that each cell has one nucleus. You may think that all cells have that, but you'll see in a minute that that's not always true. Again, this occurs in the walls of internal organs, and so whenever you hear this term, visceral, it refers to the internal organs. So smooth muscle is going to be quite associated, for example, with our intestines. It helps squeeze through a process. I'm going to give you this term also, peristalsis. And I misspelled that, sorry. Peristalsis, there's no A there. Sorry. So what you're going to see in smooth muscle is kind of a squeezing action, and that you're going to associate with like intestines or inside of the esophagus, for example. And note that this is going to be involuntary. That is, you don't control it. You don't make your smooth muscles contract. That's actually going to be controlled by your autonomic nervous system, your ANS. You do not have conscious control over this. So this is all going to be involuntary. The next type that we have here, obviously, is going to be associated with the heart. This is going to be cardiac muscle. It is striated. It's hard to see on the micrograph here, but you can see in the picture little stripes, little dark lines that kind of run like like stripes through here. These are going to be branched. Notice how these fibers are going to be kind of connected and branched, and uninucleated. Once again, one nucleus per cell. Obviously, this only occurs in the heart. These are cardiac cells. And once again, involuntary. You don't have to consciously make your heart beat. That would be bad because you would fall asleep and die. So, involuntary. And again, smooth and cardiac, we won't spend a whole lot of time on. We'll spend more time on them, obviously, later in A&P 1 and 2. But we're going to focus a little more attention on the last type over here. This is skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is going to be what we associate with that which is attached to our skeleton, but even things like your tongue is skeletal muscle. Any muscle that's voluntary and has this arrangement is considered to be skeletal. So it is striated. Again, if you look very carefully, you'll see little stripes here, and we'll look at the origins of that in a second. They're more like tubes than branched, and they are multinucleated. So you will have more than one nucleus per cell. And as you see here, usually attached to the skeleton, but as I just mentioned, any voluntary muscle that has this arrangement is considered skeletal. So you have two types that are involuntary, smooth and cardiac, one type that's voluntary. And if you want to make this muscle move, you send a nerve signal via your nervous system. And we have over here the autonomic nervous system. We have another branch called the somatic nervous system, and that's under voluntary control. And we'll talk about that in the next unit. But once again, please note they're different anatomies: spindle-shaped, branched, tubular, uninucleate, uninucleate, and multinucleate. So some major differences to focus on. So muscles help us move. We get that. But what else do muscles do? I just want to give you a list here and have you think about where the muscle is that would do these things. Obviously, the muscles can provide some protection for internal organs. If you look at just the muscular anatomy, the muscle does provide a bit of a barrier. Toned muscle does provide a barrier to trauma, for example. Muscle generates heat. We don't think about that as a major function of muscle, but it is true that muscle does generate quite a bit of heat. 40% of your body mass, for example, is skeletal muscle. So when your skeletal muscle begins to move, it generates quite a bit of heat, which is important for homeostasis. Muscle stabilizes joints. We talked about this specifically in class talking about the knee. So a good, strong musculature around a joint helps stabilize it, helps maintain posture and body position. You may think that's the same thing as movement, but it really isn't. When you are just holding your head up, you require muscle contractions to hold your head up. So even when you're not moving, you're going to have a lot of muscle contractions accounting for your body position. Muscle also facilitates or hinders passage through hollow organs and blood vessels. And all that means, okay, things are popping up here. All that means is that when muscles open and close, they can actually let things pass through or not let things pass through. That's another important function. And I don't know where I went. And obviously, it helps push blood through the heart. Finally, for this video, I want to emphasize one important idea that tends to confuse students. When we talk about muscle tissue, and here you see a good example of those stripes. This is striated. This is actually skeletal muscle. When you look at muscle tissue versus the organ itself, when you look at this, I don't know why I don't have a marker either, there's a difference. Muscle tissue helps make up skeletal muscle, but skeletal muscle is actually an organ. What is in that tissue there, what is in this organ that we call the biceps? You're going to have this tissue. You're going to have skeletal muscle tissue, but you're also going to have nerves, and you're going to have connective tissue, and it's going to be very vascular. So there's a difference between when we say muscle referring to the organ and muscle when we're referring to the tissue. It's easy to kind of get those things thinking they're the same thing. Oh, what's that? Well, it's muscle. Technically, that's an organ. This is the tissue. A lot of this tissue, it's in here, but not only muscle tissue is in here. You have, again, vascularity, connective tissue. You're going to have nerve tissue, etc. So So I make sure we have that distinction. Okay, that does it for this video. We've got one more in this series. Thank you very much.